When Nazi Germany invaded Russia in June 1941, the Soviet regime under Joseph Stalin teetered on the brink of collapse. By December, the Germans had driven the Russians back over 600 miles and were at the gates of Moscow. What followed is one of the most remarkable turnarounds in military history. 3 years later, the Russians were at the gates of Berlin. This film is about why Stalin would eventually emerge as the big winner from World War II, and what the cost would be for Russia, Europe, and the world. Stalin had to learn to bend and compromise in order to win. He would even enter into perhaps the most bizarre shotgun marriage in diplomatic history, sealed with an arch-capitalist during a drunken evening in the Kremlin.
Stalin had a strange, almost seductive charm. Winston Churchill, an unremitting enemy of communism, responded with respect, at times even affection, towards the man he himself nicknamed Uncle Joe. This is the enduring mystery of Stalin, the friendly uncle and the man of steel, a titan of the Second World War and a monster of the 20th century. We got away with it.
Stalin made a critical decision soon after the German invasion. Much of Soviet industry lay west of Moscow, easy pickings for Hitler. So the Russians dismantled some 1,500 factories, put them on trains together with workers and families, and then rebuilt them east of the Ural Mountains.
The scale was incredible. Over 1 million railway wagons were needed. Placed end to end, it was estimated, they would have stretched right across the country, from Poland to the Pacific.
What made ordinary Russians, soldiers and civilians, struggle so tenaciously? Here's one story which I think captures the spirit of Russian resistance in 1941. Fleeing the German onslaught on the road to Moscow, the war correspondent Vasily Grossman was given shelter by an old peasant woman. She used up her tiny stock of supplies, welcoming him with a good meal and a roaring fire, all the while singing songs. She told Grossman of her son fighting at the front and of her nightmares. The devil came to me last night and sank his claws into my hand. I started to pray, but the devil took no notice. So I told him to fuck off, and then he did disappear. Grossman was very struck by this typically Russian mix of generosity and bloody-mindedness.
If we do win in this terrible, cruel war, it will be because there are such noble hearts in our nation. They illuminate all our people with a miraculous light. For this old woman and for millions of Russians, their defiance was rooted in a deeper sense of homeland, of Russia's history and faith that stretched back long before Lenin and Stalin.
One popular wartime poem tapped into this mood, imagining the ghosts of the old religious Russia coming to the aid of Stalin's godless communists. It was as if, at the graves in each Russian village, guarding the living with the sign of the cross, our ancestors were gathering to pray for their grandsons who no longer believe in a god.
With customary opportunism, Stalin responded to this resurgent sense of history. And Russians in turn responded to Stalin, or more precisely to the heroic image of Stalin projected by the regime. The man of steel, the modern Tsar, became a symbol for the Russian people of their determination to resist the new invaders.
За полный разгром немецких захватчиков. Смерть немецким оккупантам.
Stalin accelerated his transformation into nationalist leader. His speech for the Revolution Day parade in November invoked Lenin, but also the Russian heroes who'd repulsed earlier invaders, including the Tsarist general Kutuzov, hero of the war against Napoleon.
Да здравствует наша славная Родина, ее свобода.
The troops paraded through Red Square and marched straight on to the front. Moscow was now under almost nightly attack from the Luftwaffe. The Kremlin's air raid shelters had not yet been completed, so for a few days Stalin shared the ordeal of ordinary Muscovites, dossing down in his greatcoat alongside them in one of the metro stations. By December the 2nd, 1941, German advance units were only a dozen miles from the Kremlin. Its domes and spires glinted in the pale sun. One German medical officer reached a tram stop on the road into the city.
There was an old wooden bin attached to the wall. I felt inside and dragged out a handful of old tram tickets. We picked out the Cyrillic letters, which by now we knew spelt Moskva. But there was to be no easy ride into Moscow for those German soldiers. This vast replica of a tank tram marks the end of the line for them. The point where Barbarossa, once molten fire, literally froze up.
Temperatures were now 30 below. Tank and plane engines had to be heated for hours before they could be started. Many German soldiers lacked winter clothing, even proper gloves, victims of Hitler's hubris about a quick victory. Seizing their chance, Stalin and his chief of staff, Zhukov, now planned a dramatic counterattack. Before dawn on December the 5th, Soviet troops ploughed into the frozen Nazi pincers around Moscow. Although the Germans weren't routed, they were driven back 100 miles. At last for the Russians, after 6 months of defeat, a first victory. But could they keep it up?